Hello, everybody, and welcome. I'm Santosh Krishnan. I'm a senior consultant with InfoTrellis, and I'll be hosting today's webinar. Some webinar details before we get started. So, please feel free to post all your questions during the course of this webinar, and we'll try our best to answer all of them at the end of this presentation. You can do this using the questions tab on your GoToWebinar control panel. And today's webinar will be recorded, and a copy of it will be made available. So today's webinar is on the effective implementation of your data governance program by Mr. Sunil Soares. Sunil is the founder and managing partner of Information Asset. Prior to this role, Sunil was the director of information governance at IBM. He has consulted with major financial institutions at the financial services strategy consulting practice of Booz Allen and Hamilton in New York prior to joining IBM. Sunil has worked with more than 100 clients across 6 continents and multiple industries through his professional career. Sunil's books on data governance have been used by several organizations as their blueprint for their information governance programs. I'd like to express my heartfelt thanks to Sunil for taking time out of his busy schedule for this exciting session. Thank you, Sunil. Before I hand over the webinar to Sunil, I would like to give you a quick introduction about InfoTrellis. InfoTrellis was founded in 2007 by Mu, Sachin, and Zayed, who were the lead architects of the original MDM solution, IBM MDM Server, while at DWL Inc. in Toronto. DWL was acquired by IBM in 2005. IBM's MDM solutions, as you now know, is the leader in the MDM space. So we have a highly successful track record in MDM implementation through our time-tested smart MDM methodology. We have executed several complex projects for several Fortune 500 companies in the information management space, MDM in particular, across business domains in North America, Europe, Asia, and Africa. We have over 225 consultants, and our offices are located in Toronto, Austin, and Chennai. We are also working on big data products, which is Connect ID to our sister concern AllSight, which, in the words of our founders, is the next-gen managed data hub. My colleague Prashant Nair will discuss more about our other product, Veriscope, during this course of this presentation. I once again take this opportunity to extend a warm welcome to all of you. It's now my pleasure to hand over this webinar to Sunil.
Hey everybody, this is Sunil Soares. My company's name is Information Asset, and we're a boutique consulting firm focused on data governance. And we provide end-to-end services for data governance across the entire life cycle, including consulting, training, tool evaluation, and product implementation. The book on the left was one I published early last year, and it was focused on an approach by the Chief Data Officer to data governance. So not really how you would implement data governance, but how you would approach it from a board perspective. On this page, is book number 1 that I published 5 years ago on the IBM Data Governance Unified process. If you ever spend any time with the IBM team, they probably gave you a copy of this book, and it goes through a series of steps to implement data governance. The book on the right is how you would go about selling information governance to the business from an industry perspective and a job function perspective. So it's got chapters on banking, insurance, healthcare, as well as product management, marketing, finance, etc. The book on the left here is a book I published last year on actually a couple of years ago, on data governance tools. So it goes through about 22 different tools in terms of how they fit into a broader tapestry and reference architecture for data governance. And the book on the right, fits in with the discussion earlier by Santosh around how do you govern big data. So now let's talk to you a little bit about, how you would approach data governance. So we've coined this term called data governance in a box. And what we're saying is, there's a number of different pieces to, governing your data. And what we've done is we've defined a 16-step process, not dissimilar to what, if any of you have seen the book I published a few years ago, not similar to the, the unified process, but it's, I would say, a little more operational. So I'm just going to walk through these 16 steps at a high level, and then we'll hit a few salient points in the rest of this presentation. So step number 1 is develop a data governance playbook. So think of the data governance playbook as the way you would, establish your data governance program. really, starting with what are your policies, standards, and processes. If you think about a playbook, the table of contents might be, data ownership, metadata management, data quality management, reference data, data security and privacy. And it's going to cover topics like, what types of data owners do we need? Do we need business data stewards? Do we need technical data stewards? Do we need a data governance lead? Do we need a data governance executive? It even gets down into minutiae. For example, what are the data quality dimensions we're going to use to define our data quality rules and do data profiling? Because if you talk to 5 companies, you get 7 different definitions of data quality dimensions like completeness and conformity. The next step is establishing your data categories, analogous to defining your taxonomies. So as a critical precursor to defining data stewardship and data ownership, you need to classify your data at the enterprise level. And that's honestly a very interesting tug of war between data governance and data architecture, because data architecture may say, okay, here's our enterprise logical data model, and we believe customers should be an enterprise level data category. But the data governance team may look at it and say, hold on a second, that's interesting, but we don't really have customer owner at the enterprise level, right? We might have 3 customer owners in 3 different lines of business. And frankly, that's one of the challenges with MDM as well. And so, of course, establishing a data category and taxonomy is quite critical. The next step, now that you've defined your playbook and your categories, is to say, how do we appoint our data stewards, right? Are they on the business side? Are they IT side? Do we have a hierarchy of data stewards? We have a data steward, and then maybe we have someone who's a manager. Maybe we have a data executive. That needs to be laid out, and those folks need to be appointed by data category. The next step is to identify critical data elements for your data category. So if you've got customer as a data category, for example, you might have multiple level 2 categories. You might have customer identity. You might have customer contact information. You might have customer preferences. And under customer identity, you might have date of birth. You might have social security number as critical data elements. Under contact information, you might have address, and then you might have billing address, mailing address, seasonal address, etc. Then step number 5 is building your data standards, which include your data quality rules. So for example, for your completeness dimension of data quality, you might say social security number should not be null, as an example. You might also define rules that are more around acceptable use. What can you do and not use with the data? What can you do with social security number? Well, it should generally be masked, and it should not be shared with third parties. Creating a data quality dashboard. So once you've done some profiling of your data, you want to generate a data quality dashboard. Then you want to remediate your data issues in number 7. Number 8 starts to get interesting, because clearly when you're looking at certain industries like banking and financial services, and you're dealing with BCBS 239 and DFAST, which is the Dodd-Frank Act stress testing, or CCAR from the Federal Reserve, they specifically require you to govern your risk models from an ownership perspective, from a metadata perspective. What's the lineage in terms of inputs and outputs? And do you have a separate model validation process? So clearly, in certain industries more than others, governing not just the data, but also the models, and these are not data models, these are analytical models, whether they're risk or predictive models, is also critical. Something we're seeing quite a bit of in the industry is also managing and governing end user computing. So this could be spreadsheets, Microsoft Access databases, SharePoint repositories, Ribbit repositories, where you've got information which could be structured or it could be unstructured. It could be Excel files, it could be Access databases, or it could just be PDFs. So really, you've got to think about how we're managing end user computing EUCs from a metadata perspective and a data ownership perspective, and also identifying if any of those repositories have PII, and then managing them potentially from a records management perspective as well. Then finally, stitching together data lineage across your critical data elements, your backend systems, potentially all the way to the mainframe, your data quality rules, and then tying that all back together with your models and your EUCs. Implementing security and privacy standards. This could involve data masking. It could involve database monitoring with a tool like Guardium. and then governing the life cycle of information, test data management, data archiving, in terms of some of the tools from IBM like Optum. And then we get into another area that's getting a lot of interest, which is data sharing agreements. So if you've defined your data standards and now you're sending data, especially with an MDM to a downstream application, are there data sharing agreements that really manage and help you manage your data quality and your acceptable use standards? We'll talk a little bit about that. In many instances, sometimes you'll have a senior executive in a company who has to attest to the quality and the trustworthiness of the data. So that's number 14. And then what we've seen is you need a mechanism to monitor and enforce compliance with data governance. So monitoring is really, using a data governance dashboard as opposed to a data quality dashboard to measure adherence with the policies and standards that you've defined in number 1. And then in certain industries, even turning over those policies and standards to your internal audit department potentially, where they could conduct data audits, or you could even have the data governance team conduct data audits themselves. So that's a quick snapshot of this data governance in a box process. What I'm going to do now is talk a little bit about how that applies to your data governance program itself. So let's take a very simple example. We've got an auto insurer, and this auto insurer has an MDM hub, and they potentially have millions of customers in the MDM hub. So what we're going to do is take a very simple MDM example and then sort of decompose the artifacts as they relate to that data governance in a box approach we discussed earlier. So right off the bat, okay, if you say I want to govern MDM, what does that mean? Well, you probably have an attribute called registration type, which is an MDM, right? So you might have maybe 1,000 attributes in your MDM hub. One of them is registration type. Well, so now let's pull up the logical data model, or maybe even the physical data model for MDM, and we see right there we've also got another attribute called registration type. Now working with the governance team, the data modelers and the data governance team and the data architecture team say, okay, we believe registration type is actually a critical data element. So what we have to do is we're going to have to come up with a definition for registration type. And then we're going to come up with what I would call the manifest of attributes that really define what this critical data element would be. So in addition to a definition, we'll need to have, who the data steward is. We're going to define some business rules, some data quality rules. So let's work through that process. So on the next page here, we said, okay, for this particular critical data element, we're going to define some business rules. And in this case, I'm using business rules and data quality rules interchangeably, though that is not necessarily the case. So in this case, we're saying we have a data quality rule which says that the party should have an approved registration type. So that is part of the conformity dimension of data quality. So if you think of completeness, a completeness data quality rule might say registration type should not be null, but the conformity dimension says party should have an approved registration type. So those could be two distinct data quality rules. And then associated with that critical data element and the data quality rule, I've got some reference data, which is the list of registration types. What are the allowable registration types? So if I'm an insurance company and I'm selling insurance policies for auto insurance, what are the types of registration that I'm going to accept? Well, I'm going to accept driver's license. I'm going to accept maybe passport. I'm going to accept maybe a health insurance card. And there's a list of acceptable registration types that need to be maintained somewhere in my data governance environment. So this is step number 5, where we discussed building data standards. Now I'm going to turn it over to the InfoTrellis team, who will talk a little bit about Veriscope and data quality dashboards.
Hello. All right. Thanks.
Hello, yes.
This is Prashant from InfoTrellis. Since we are talking about data quality dashboards, I'd like to introduce you to Veriscope. Veriscope is an InfoTrellis product, which is basically a reporting tool. It was a brainchild of our VP of products, Dave Burian, and it incorporates over a decade of experience and the best practices in MDM. So that was Veriscope on a high level view. We can just go into a more detailed view, right? So Veriscope reports, we have over 15 Veriscope reports, OTB reports, which are like business reports, audit reports, data quality reports, and system reports. So our clients, the business users, and our data stewards, the client data stewards, they actually use Veriscope for a lot of different purposes. You could use Veriscope to monitor your system's performance. You could use it to monitor the data quality, the changes in the data quality trends, and you could actually some of our business users actually use it to see the categories of the data. So you could see, for example, some of our clients actually see how many of their products are in a prototype stage, or how many of their products are commercially released, or how many of their customers are there in the state of New York, right? So as Sunil was talking about the data quality rules, we have over 1,000 pre-configured scans. Scans are nothing but data quality rules, which came out of the experience that our founders had. So for example, let's say when a zip code in North America should not be more than 5 digits. That could be a data quality rule. And based on your the importance that an address plays in your business, you could actually give it importance of a high, a medium, or a low issue. Sunil, if we could just move on to the next one, the next slide. Yeah, there you go. So here you see the dashboard. This is the Veriscope dashboard. This which shows you a lot of information about the data quality. If you look at the left tab, it shows you how many high issues, how many mediums. Then it shows you a very pictorial, a very visual graph about how many highs, mediums. The good thing about this, very interesting thing about this is this actually gives you the trend of how your data issues were detected and how it was resolved. So you can actually track the efficiency of your data stewards in resolving these issues as well. The last graph on the right that you see is the backlog trend. You can see how much of a backlog you have. So these reports could be used to monitor the efficiency of your data stewards and cleaning up the data as well. So that was Veriscope on a very high level. So now you can just go on to the next slide.
Right. So now step number 7 in our data governance in a box approach was remediate data issues. So I'll just recap again. We had an attribute called registration type within our MDM hub, which was associated with a logical model attribute, also called registration type, which was associated with the registration type critical data element, which was associated with the conformity rule around parties should have an approved registration type. We have a list of registration types like driver's license and passport. Now what we've done is we built a data quality scorecard, for example, which would have the percentage of non-compliant records. And then it's going to kick out, a set of data issues which would have to be fixed. So we'd have to be fixing non-compliant records. They'd be identifying by somebody who's doing the data profiling, and it would be sent to potentially a data steward who's going to resolve those issues based on the level of revenue or cost impact. So then finally, what we want to do is we link that all together. So if you look at the bottom right corner here, we just added the column name. So we could say, okay, this is coming from a source system. It could be an operational data hub, which also has a field called registration type. And now we've got some lineage. So if you see right here, we're stitching together multiple dimensions of data governance just around one simple attribute for MDM. We're stitching together the attribute of the MDM hub, the logical model attribute, the business term, which is a critical data element, data quality rules, data quality scorecard, issue resolution, and metadata, right? So obviously, you don't want to be doing this for every single field in your MDM hub, and that's why you have the concept of a critical data element. As an aside, critical data elements are generally those elements that have an outsized impact on regulatory compliance, operational performance, or financial reporting, and they generally should not be more than 5 to 10% of your total attributes. So now let's talk about another topic of interest, which is data sharing agreements. So let's provide some background in terms of what data sharing agreements are and why they're needed. So in many organizations, especially when you're looking at an MDM program, you observe the phenomenon of data hoarding. So the producing division does not trust that the consuming division will use the data appropriately, and the consuming division is frustrated that data belongs to the company and not to the individual divisions. So this really, goes against the grain when you're thinking about an MDM platform, because of a lack of trust, the producing division will tend to hoard its data and creates a lot of consternation, I guess, and lack of productivity for a lot of these consuming divisions and for the organization as a whole. So let's give you an example of where you might see a demand for data sharing agreements. So chat logs. So the customer service department is having chats right through their customer service representatives with customers. Now these chat logs may be what are called pre-login and post-login. So it's pre-login. A customer is on the website. They would like to chat with the customer service representative, and they do so. Those chat logs generally may not contain a lot of sensitive and personally identifiable information. But what may happen is they may be requested to log in as a customer and then continue with the chat so they can have a more detailed conversation with the customer service representative. In that case, you would fully expect that the chat log is going to contain some sensitive data. It might contain account number, financial transaction information, social security numbers, etc. Those chat logs are maintained generally for a period of time. They may be required to be maintained by the SEC from a regulatory standpoint, but even otherwise, the customer service department may maintain the chat logs for a while. Now, there may be a demand or a request from the data scientists, the big data team, to get access to those chat logs because they would like to analyze them using text analytics, because they really want to understand why customers are interacting with the customer service department. Because if they can get to the underlying reasons and complaints, they might be able to nip those issues in the bud. That sounds great, but there might be some concern from the customer service department that these chat logs may contain sensitive data. So you can see a case to be made for a data sharing agreement between the customer service department and the data scientists to say, we will share chat logs with you, but that unstructured information regarding sensitive data needs to be masked. So what are the contents of a data sharing agreement? The data sharing agreement is typically will have the list of attributes being shared, responsibility for data quality. So if, for example, the MDM hub is sharing data with a downstream system, the data sharing agreement is going to say, here's the attributes I'm sharing with you, right? System number XYZ. I'm sharing, customer social, first name, middle initial, last name, billing address, etc. Then responsibility for data quality. Who's accountable for poor data quality? Is it the MDM hub, or is it some upstream system that actually sent data to the MDM hub? Who's accountable for acceptable use standards for the data being shared? So if the MDM hub is sending data to a downstream system, is the downstream system also accountable to observe any acceptable use standards? So for example, are they also accountable to observe standards around masking social, masking and not sharing third-party, sharing customer contact information with third parties? So that's an important component of a data sharing agreement. Another component could be restrictions on how data might be shared with additional downstream consumers. So if the MDM hub is sharing it with another department and that department is further propagating it, is that allowed or is it not allowed? So finally, what I'd like to do is talk to you a little bit about, sort of where data governance and the tooling falls within an enterprise data management reference architecture. So this is a simple reference architecture we've used in the time, which really is around enterprise data management. So right at the bottom, you'll see a series of data sources. And then, that data is coming in from various source systems, right? And we're looking at databases. They could be NoSQL databases, in-memory databases like SAP HANA, relational, and legacy. Then you've got data modeling tools. You might have IBM's InfoSphere tooling for data modeling, or ER Studio or Irwin, and then data integration tools. So bulk movement of data, so ETL, so Power Center from Informatica or Data Stage, replication technologies of virtualization. And then we go from 5 through 11, which we consider to be sort of core to data governance. So we've got the data profiling tools, data quality tools, glossary and metadata. And then, of course, Veriscope falls squarely within number 5 and number 6. Some of the IBM InfoSphere tools also complement 5 and 6. In addition, you've got the IBM Information Governance Catalog in 7 and 8. Information policy management is another component of the IBM InfoSphere tooling. And then master data management, which is certainly an area that InfoTrellis specializes from a services perspective, as well as reference data management. And then finally, you've got data warehouses and data marts. So these are, for example, or Greenplum, analytics and reporting. So that's Cognos, Tableau. And on the left side, you've got business process management, data security. So that would be the Optum and Guardian tools, and information lifecycle management. Once again, Optum. And on the right side, you've got Hadoop, streaming. So something like IBM Streams, text analytics, and cloud. And the key here is to understand, okay, when you're looking at data governance, how do components 5 through 11 really relate to everything else? So as one simple example, if you're thinking about business process management, what is the process to add a new business term? So if I'm a number 7 and I've got a business term that I'm adding, is there a business process to add in or workflow to add in a new business term? And using a tool like IBM Stewardship Center in conjunction with Information Governance Catalog would be a good fit there. We've done that with a few clients. So that in a nutshell is sort of our overall enterprise data management reference architecture, as well as a mapping to data governance. So at this point, I'm done with my formal presentation. I'm just going to turn it back over to the InfoTrellis team so they can handle questions.
Thank you so much, Sunil. If you have any questions, please feel free to use the questions tab to post your questions. So yes, we have a question now. Just give me a second. And the question is, okay, are the steps listed in the data governance in a box framework sequential? Sunil, if you can answer that.
Let me answer that question. So let's go back to the data governance in a box right now. I get that question quite a bit. And I think this is a simplified way to think about data governance, right? If you try to complicate it by showing all the permutations and combinations, it sort of misses the point. So the answer is they're not, they're not sequential, and you could probably follow the steps in a slightly different order, and you might focus on some steps more than other steps for certain use cases. So for example, if you're thinking about an MDM use case, maybe number 8 around model governance and number 9 around end user computing might be less important. If you're looking at an approach around compliance with some of the stress testing in the banks, then we can certainly see lineage is very critical. Number 10, data quality, number 6 and 7 are critical, and then 15 and 16 in terms of monitoring and enforcement are absolutely critical.
Thank you for that, Sunil. We have another question. So, what are the main challenges that you have encountered while implementing data governance from your experience?
The main challenges when encountering data governance tend to be business buy-in, right? So I think this is a pretty exhaustive, lengthy process. And if you don't have the right level of business buy-in and executive sponsorship, it can be a real challenge. And I think that probably extends to MDM as well, which is why many organizations tend to get the impetus because of some regulatory requirement, right? Clearly in banking, there are some regulatory requirements, same thing in insurance. So I think it's finding that sweet spot where the business really cares about something and maybe there's a regulation associated with it. Even this emerging area around, big data analytics is critical because you really need good data to be able to support, insightful analytics.
Thank you
Yes,
for that.
Santosh?
Yeah, I would again like to encourage the audience to please post your questions. So yeah, I have another question here. So does data governance always have to be a separate dedicated effort?
No, it doesn't. I think the question was, does data governance have to be a separate dedicated effort? It doesn't. But I think if you, as with anything, if you really want to get things done properly, then you are well served to have a dedicated team that's focused on data governance. Though I have seen organizations in the past where the data governance lead tends to be, tends to have more than one hat. Increasingly, I've seen that's changed. I think we definitely have a data governance lead who's 100% dedicated to data governance. He or she may have a department that's focused. I think the question is with the data stewards, are the data stewards 100% data stewards, or are they also doing other things? And in many cases, we see the data stewards are subject matter experts and they've got a day job, and then they're also data stewards probably 20% of the time. And that's not a bad thing, because if they become 100% data stewards, they might lose their subject matter expertise. But clearly, I think it's important to have some kind of service level agreement with the data steward management to agree that they'll spend X% of their time doing data stewardship on a week in and week out basis.
Thank you, Sunil. So there's another question. So data governance. Okay. How do you show return on investment on your data governance program?
That's a great question. I think how do you show return on investment? I think if there's a compliance use case, then sometimes you don't have to show a return on investment because frankly the regulators need it. If there's something around number 11, which is implementing security and privacy, certainly companies don't want to be able to do that. I'll tell you, in my second book on selling information governance to the business, we had probably 40 examples of very simple business cases around return on investment. And it all starts, I think, with the data categories and the critical data elements. So if you've defined what are the critical data elements that are driving your program, you understand what's the driver, then it becomes much easier to define, to figure out what that return on investment looks like.
Thank you, Sunil. I don't see any more questions. So, oh, just a minute. I have. So, here's a question: do other organizations that you have worked with in reference to information lifecycle management have the policy geared towards how long data needs to be retained from a state stature perspective, or how long data needs to be retained from an analytical perspective? Should the piece about how long data needs to be retained from a state stature perspective rest with the compliance unit?
Okay. Yeah, so I think all generally retention policies are developed in conjunction with compliance, and I think you definitely have some very interesting discussions to be had around how long you retain certain data, right? And I think you oftentimes get into an interesting tug of war between the compliance department and maybe certain line of business folks. So obviously, if data is available, it's subject to discovery, right? So you have the concept of defensible disposition, but certain business units may definitely need data for a longer period of time. So if you think about claims, the claims data in an insurance company has to be retained for a certain period of time based on state mandates. But if you're thinking about the actuarial department and they're analyzing, long tail risk, they want to understand the concept of a massive weather event that happens maybe once every 100 years. They're going to need at least some level of aggregate claims information for well beyond the traditional claims period. So the answer is yes, you're going to have to decide what that retention period is, not just at the state level or federal level or regulatory perspective. You also got to bring in an analytical perspective in conjunction with your data scientists and the business areas.
Thank you, Sunil. There are a few more questions actually. So, could you please describe data models used for different types of data warehouses?
Yeah, so obviously there's the conceptual model, the logical model, and the physical model. I was focused less on those models because I think people have a good handle on how to include them within governance and metadata. The real focus here was around the analytical models. So think of them as the risk models or the propensity models or the predictive models that are being developed by data scientists in tools like SAS, R, or SPSS. So the point here is that those models also need, if you look at this year, these models also need to be maintained from a governance perspective. So if you look at number 8, governing of the analytical models, you need to really treat those models just as another data set that needs to be governed, which means you need to establish ownership for the models. You need to understand what are the input variables, what are the output variables, what's the methodology being used for the models. Is there an independent process to what is called backtesting to understand if the performance of the model matches with what the model predicted? And are you stitching that model into your broader lineage from an enterprise perspective?
Thank you, and thank you, Sunil. We have, I think, 5 or 6 more questions which have come in. Please feel free to post your questions using the questions tab. So here's another question. So could you please describe in more detail the first 3 steps in the data governance in a box?
Okay, so the first 3 steps in data governance in a box. So the first one is developing a data governance playbook. It's really defining your policies, your standards, and your processes. So a policy is a high-level statement. It includes one or more standards, and a standard is implemented by one or more processes. So if you think about a data ownership policy, that data ownership policy is going to be implemented by a set of standards. Could be a data stewardship standard, a technical data stewardship standard, right? It really defines the policy on how you're going to implement your data governance program. Data categories say, how do I classify my data at the enterprise level? Even if you're doing customer MDM, you still need to define categories within customer MDM. So that's something that will come from your modeling and architecture team. But as I said earlier, it's a tug of war with data governance. So it's how do you classify data? And then that determines how you actually appoint and how you set up your data stewards. Do you have, a data steward for customer contacts? And frankly, if you have 3 definitions of customer across the enterprise, that might be okay, but then you might have 3 different data stewards for customer. Back to you.
Thank you, Sunil. I think there's another question related to what you just said. So, what kind of training should an organization provide to their appointed data stewards?
Yeah, so I think it's a pretty complex task, right? If you think about data governance and data stewardship, the steward is really working through pretty much all these steps at some level of detail. They may not be defining everything themselves. They may be taking something that's defined by the Data Governance Program Office. So generally, there might be training around functional, right? How does a data steward identify a critical data element? What are the criteria? How do they build a data standard? And then there might be some technical training that the data steward might have to do. If they're sitting in front of the MDM tool, how do they manage duplicates, for example? How do they identify duplicates? How do they match dupes? How do they deal with data profiling and data issue resolution? So generally, there is a whole a series of steps that you would go through as a data steward. We've actually do a fair amount of work. We've got standard data stewardship training, but then we typically would customize it for an organization using whatever tools they have and, based on the industry. And we actually run data stewards through what we call a data stewardship certification, which could be a 1 or 2 day exercise where they go through, some version of a data governance in a box for their industry, for their company, and using whatever tools they have in place. And then we certify them at the end of the training class. We give them a series of questions and they get certified. And that just gives everybody a feeling of accomplishment. But of course, it's just the start. Over to you.
Thank you, Sunil. So here's an interesting question. So what governance best practices fit into this process when an organization is in limbo between migrating from their old legacy repository to a new MDM ecosystem?
I think all of these apply, right? They've still got to develop a playbook. They've got to establish categories, appointing data stewards, identifying critical data elements. Because if you're moving data from a legacy system into MDM, you still got to figure out what your critical data elements. You've got to have a data dictionary for the legacy system, right? You've got to understand that there are duplicates. You've got to deal with the data stewardship. So the answer is all of the above. All of these apply. Of course, the level of emphasis may change based on where the organization is. And oftentimes, I've seen organizations say we still have to do a level of work, because typically in any data migration, whether it's MDM or you're implementing an SAP hub, 40% of the cost of that data migration is really around data governance, right? And that cost tends to be hidden. So you might want to be assertive upfront and say, let's not wait for the MDM project to begin to start doing work around sort of understanding what our legacy system looks like.
Here's another question. So, what is the difference between data governance dashboards and data governance scorecards? And which one is useful for which purpose? Can you please share some examples?
So if you look at number 6, a data quality dashboard is really around data quality, right? It's potentially talking about what's the quality of your data, right? By dimension, and might be rolled up into, an entity like customer. A data governance dashboard says, what's our level of adherence to our data governance policy? So, a data governance dashboard may say, okay, we have 5 departments in the company, and we're based on certain specific criteria. We've given each of them a score for data stewardship. We've given each of them a score around how they're implementing metadata. We've given each of them a score on how they're setting up data sharing agreements. And there's methods to be as quantitative as possible as opposed to being totally qualitative. So that's the difference between a data quality dashboard and a data governance dashboard.
All right. Here's another question. So, do you track each unit attendance at stewardship meetings as a metric on the DG's dashboard?
Yes, that's a good one. You've got to you can sort of maybe take it up a level and call it a data stewardship participation index potentially, right? That data stewardship participation index says not only have we've identified data stewards, that's great, but what's the level of participation in the meetings? And of course, someone can still come to the meeting and not pay any attention. That could be hard to measure, but you can measure tangibly, if there were 20 meetings in a year and this department's data stewards only attended 10, then, the data stewardship participation index was 50%, something like that. So yeah, it's definitely a way to be quantitative about the level of participation by data stewards in the data governance program.
Can you speak to the challenges with identifying a single owner of a master data domain where multiple business lines could be contributing? Oh, that's another.
That's probably one of the biggest challenges with an MDM program, right? That's right there, which is not everyone agrees that you have one owner for anything. So I think that's the challenge, right? So you just as you may not have one owner for the definition of customer, can you really have one owner for data at the enterprise level? And that can frankly be the biggest inhibitor to an enterprise data governance program. Do we have agreement on that? So obviously the ways to do that might be to get ownership is to break it down, establishing those data categories, right? So data categories at what I would call level 1. So level 1 might be customer, level 2 might be under customer, can be classified as data can be classified as data ownership. Sorry about that. Can be classified as data owner. Can be classified as customer contacts or customer preferences. But even then, you might have a challenge because you have multiple departments who feel like they own the same piece of information. In that case, you probably want to have some business rules that talk about who gets to decide when a particular attribute needs to be updated in the MDM hub.
There are no more questions now. So thank you, Sunil, for that wonderful session. And I thank everybody for taking time out of their busy schedules and joining us today. So if you have any further questions or feedback, please feel free to write to us. You will get a survey at the end of the session, and I request all of you to spare a minute of your time to fill that up. So thank you, everyone, once again. Have a great day.